Hey guys, tonight we're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages, specifically the quiet, grueling world behind monastery walls. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but to the clang of a wooden clapper in the cold dark, hours before sunrise. It's called matins. The first of up to 8 church services you'll attend todays, starting sometime between 2 and 4 a.m. You haven't eaten yet. You're not supposed to talk. Your mattress is straw. And you've barely been asleep for hours. Welcome to your new job as a monk. Now, technically speaking, this job isn't just employment-y, it's a calling. But let's be honest. For many, it was also an escape. Maybe your family had too many sons. Maybe you couldn't inherit land. Maybe you just liked the idea of food, shelter, and a roof over your head. But even in this sanctuary, comfort was not part of the plan. Monks followed a strict routine set by something called the Rule of Saint Benedict, written back in the 6th century. And by the Dark Ages, that rule was still the gold standard in many Western European monasteries. It detailed every aspect of your day, from when to rise, to what to say, to how long you should chew your food. Yes, really, after that groggy, candlelit first service, you'd return to your cell, not for sleep, but for spiritual reading. But reading wasn't as casual as it sounds. Remember, no eyeglasses yet. Books were handwritten. Most were in Latin. You didn't read silently either, at least not yet. That innovation came later. Reading meant murmuring, even humming, the words aloud, like a prayer. If your Latin was rusty, good luck. Sometime around 6 a.m., it's time for Lauds and other service. Then comes prime, and then, finally, you're permitted to eat. But breakfast isn't pancakes or porridge. It's often bread, sometimes stale, dipped in watered-down wine or beer. Meat, not unless you're dying. The rule forbade meat from 4-legged animals. Fish was allowed, but not if you were inland. Then it's lentils again. Next comes manual labor. Yes, monks didn't just pray, they worked. The idea was to avoid idleness, which was considered the devil's playground. You could be assigned to gardening, sweeping, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or working in the kitchens. In some places, particularly in Benedictine monasteries, monks did everything from raising sheep to tanning hides. Whatever your station, you did it quietly, mindfully, repetitively. Talking, in fact, was tightly regulated. Many monasteries had cloister silence. That meant no speaking in certain areas, like the dormitory, the library, or the refectory. If you did have to say something, you'd use sign language. Not modern sign language, mind you. This was a primitive system, gestures to indicate bread, water, I'm cold. Sometimes you'd point, sometimes just stare until someone figured it out. It was frustrating, awkward, and utterly quiet. If your job was in the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied, you'd sit bent over a desk for hours. No heating in winter, no fans in summer. Ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Quills that needed constant trimming. If your hand shook, your entire day's work might be ruined. And if you spilt ink, you could be punished with more labor. Fasting at midday, you'd attend sext, another prayer service, followed by a slightly more substantial meal. This was the big one. Perhaps boiled vegetables, barley, and more bread. The refectory, or dining hall, was silent. A designated monk read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints as everyone else chewed quietly, thinking holy thoughts, or at least pretending to. Afternoon brought more work or study. Some monasteries allowed monks to rest for an hour or so, especially in warmer regions. But don't imagine a cozy nap. You'd lie on your wooden cot in a chilly, drafty dormitory, hoping no one walked by and reminded you that laziness was a sin. By late afternoon, you'd return to the church for none the next service. Then a brief stretch of time for reflection, or individual reading, always religious in nature. No medieval detective novels, no poems about love, just psalters, gospels, or maybe the life of St. Cuthbert for the third time that month. Evening brought vespers, the final major prayer session, followed by a light supper again, simple, always meatless, and always eaten in silence. Then Compline, the final prayer of the day, lit by flickering candles and chanted in near darkness. The ritual was both soothing and exhausting. You'd kneel, chant, bow, sit, rise, and chant again. Then, finally, you could return to your cell, which might be private if you were lucky or shared with several others if you weren't. Your bed was straw, your blanket coarse wool, your pillow a folded robe. You weren't allowed to sleep naked. The rule required that monks sleep in their robes to remain ever ready for the Lord. And, again, the night was short. You'd barely drift off before being summoned again for matins. Sleep was considered a weakness. Night vigils were a virtue. Weekends offered no relief. In fact, Sundays meant more church services, longer readings, and public confessions. Monks weren't exempt from discipline either. If you spoke out of turn or overslept, you might face penance fasting, isolation, or being assigned the worst, chores. Some monasteries even had their own jail cells. Still, for all its rigidity, the monastery was a world of strange peace. Outside, Europe was torn by war, famine, and disease. Inside, at least, there was structure, predictability, a rhythm that rarely changed. For some, this was comforting. For others, stifling. It depended on how well you could adapt to the repetition, the endless loop of bells, prayer, and labor. But even among the silence, you might wonder, did anyone question it? Did monks ever want out? Or was obedience just so deeply drilled into them that they stopped noticing the weight of the days? By now, you've survived your first full day in the monastery. Your feet are sore from standing through long services. Your stomach is uneasy from simple meals of lentils and cabbage. Your tongue is unused to silence. And your mind, well, it's starting to slow down to the monastery's pace. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In the medieval monastery, the days weren't just repetitive. They were cyclical, tied tightly to the divine officer rotating series of prayer. Hours that shaped not just your schedule, but your sense of time itself. The ringing of the bell wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, pulling you out of bed, out of thought, out of whatever minor comfort you'd found, and back into rhythm with the rule. But there's more to the grind than prayers and pottage. You're starting to learn the subtleties now. The monastery is full of rules, but the people inside it, still human. You might notice that not all monks carry the same burden. There are distinctions, often unspoken. The abbot, for example, head of the monastery, has his own chamber. He eats the same meals, yes, but he often gets them warmer. He's the one who decides punishments, assigns duties, and interprets the rule when things get a bit murky. Then there are the monks who've been here longer. They know how to walk silently without dragging their sandals. They've memorized scripture passages by heart. They make the sign of the cross with practiced ease, and they know all the loopholes. Take fasting, for example. Monks fasted often then. Wednesdays, Fridays, during Lent, Advent, and other holy days. But fasting didn't always mean eating nothing. Sometimes it meant skipping the noon meal and doubling up at night, or substituting rich stews with dried peas and water. Over time, some monks got quite clever with it, thickening soups until they were basically stews again, or adding herbs to dull lentils until they tasted almost like meat. Almost then there's the question of obedience. You'd think monks were utterly devoted to their duties, and many were. But obedience in a monastery wasn't always passive. There were disagreements, quiet, mostly but real. Sometimes about the interpretation of scripture, other times about practical matters. Who was hoarding better tools in the workshop? Who left the herb garden untended? Who forgot to clean the ink pots in the scriptorium? Most monasteries had a way to deal with this, the chapter house. Every morning after prime, the community would gather there to confess faults, hear announcements, and receive assignments for the day. This wasn't a time for warm conversation. It was a mix of shame and efficiency. If you were caught breaking silence or falling asleep during compline, this was where it was mentioned. If you wanted to confess something voluntarily, now was the time. Punishments varied. For small faults, you might be ordered to eat on the floor, apart from the others, or to remain standing during the meal while others sat. For larger breaches, disobedience to the abbot or stealing food, you might be isolated from the community for days, or required to lie prostrate before the altar during service. In extreme cases, monks were even expelled. And yet, despite all this, many found deep comfort in the monotony. The repetition wasn't aimless, it was ritual. In a world where illness could take you without warning and war might arrive with a single rider's gallop, the monastery offered something the outside world couldn't: predictability. This was especially true when it came to work. As a monk, you weren't idle. In fact, laborare istare, to work is to pray, was a guiding principle. But the kind of labor varied. You might find yourself in the fields, hoeing rows of beets, or in the brewhouse, where monks carefully monitored the fermentation of ale, not just for themselves, but sometimes to trade with nearby villagers. Beer was safer than water, after all. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages, specifically the quiet, grueling world behind monastery walls. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Imagine waking up not to an alarm clock, but to the clang of a wooden clapper in the cold dark, hours before sunrise. It's called matins. The first of up to 8 church services you'll attend. Today starting sometime between 2 and 4 a.m. You haven't eaten yet. You're not supposed to talk. Your mattress is straw, and you've barely been asleep for hours. Welcome to your new job as a monk now. Technically speaking, this job isn't just employment, it's a calling. But let's be honest, for many, it was also an escape. Maybe your family had too many sons. Maybe you couldn't inherit land. Maybe you just liked the idea of food, shelter, and a roof over your head. But even in this sanctuary, comfort was not part of the plan. Monks followed a strict routine set by something called the Rule of Saint Benedict, written back in the 6th century, and by the Dark Ages, that rule was still the gold standard in many Western European monasteries. It detailed every aspect of your day, from when to rise, to what to say, to how long you should chew your food. Yes, really, after that groggy candlelit first service, you'd return to your cell, not for sleep, but for spiritual reading. But reading wasn't as casual as it sounds. Remember, No eyeglasses yet. Books were handwritten. Most were in Latin. You didn't read silently either, at least not yet. That innovation came later. Reading meant murmuring, even humming, the words aloud, like a prayer. If your Latin was rusty, good luck. Sometime around 6 a.m., it's time. For Lord's, another service. Then comes prime. And then, finally, you're permitted to eat. But breakfast isn't pancakes or porridge. It's often bread, sometimes stale, dipped in watered-down wine or beer. Meat. Not unless you're dying. The rule forbids meat from four-legged animals. Fish was allowed, but not if you were inland. Then it's lentils again. Next comes manual labor, yes. Monks didn't just pray, they worked. The idea was to avoid idleness, which was considered the devil's playground. You could be assigned to gardening, sweeping, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, or working in the kitchens. In some places, particularly in Benedictine monasteries, monks did everything from raising sheep to tanning hides. Whatever your station, you did it quietly, mindfully, repetitively. Talking, in fact, was tightly regulated. Many monasteries had cloister silence. That meant no speaking in certain areas like the dormitory, the library, or the refectory. If you did have to say something, you'd use sign language. Not modern sign language, mind you. This was a primitive system, gestures to indicate bread, water, I'm cold. Sometimes you'd point, sometimes just stare until someone figured it out. It was frustrating, awkward, and utterly quiet. If your job was in the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied, you'd sit bent over a desk for hours. No heating in winter, no fans in summer. Ink made from oak galls and iron salts. Quills that needed constant trimming. If your hand shook, your entire day's work might be ruined. And if you spilled ink, you could be punished with more labor. Fasting at midday, you'd attend sext, another prayer service, followed by a slightly more substantial meal. This was the big one. Perhaps boiled vegetables, barley, and more bread. The refectory, or dining hall, was silent. A designated monk read aloud from scripture or the lives of saints, as everyone else chewed quietly, thinking holy thoughts, or at least pretending to. Afternoon brought more work or study. Some monasteries allowed monks to rest for an hour or so, especially in warmer regions. But don't imagine a cozy nap. You'd lie on your wooden cot in a chilly, drafty dormitory, hoping no one walked by and reminded you that laziness was a sin by late afternoon. You'd return to the church for none the next service, then a brief stretch of time for reflection, or individual reading, always religious in nature. No medieval detective novels, no poems about love, just psalters, gospels, or maybe the life of St. Cuthbert, for the third time that month. Evening brought Vespers, the final major prayer session, followed by a light sup again, simple, always meatless, and always eaten in silence. Then Compline, the final prayer of the day, lit by flickering candles, enchanted in near darkness. The ritual was both soothing and exhausting. You'd kneel, chant, bow, sit, rise, and chant again. Then, finally, you could return to your cell, which might be private if you were lucky, or shared with several others if you weren't. Your bed was straw, your blanket coarse wool, your pillow a folded robe. You weren't allowed to sleep naked. The rule required that monks sleep in their robes to remain ever ready for the Lord. And, again, the night was short. You'd barely drift off before being summoned again for matins. Sleep was considered a weakness. Night vigils were a virtue. Weekends offered no relief. In fact, Sundays meant more church services, longer readings, and public confessions. Monks weren't exempt from discipline either. If you spoke out of turn or overslept, you might face penance fasting, isolation, or being assigned the worst chores. Some monasteries even had their own jail cells. Still, for all its rigidity, the monastery was a world of strange peace. Outside, Europe was torn by war, famine, and disease. Inside, at least there was structure, predictability, a rhythm that rarely changed. For some, this was comforting. For others, stifling. It depended on how well you could adapt to the repetition, the endless loop of bells, prayer, and labor. But, even among the silence, you might wonder, did anyone question it? Did monks ever want out? Or was obedience just so deeply drilled into them that they stopped noticing the weight of the days? By now, you've survived your first full day in the monastery. Your feet are sore from standing through long services. Your stomach is uneasy from simple meals of lentils and cabbage. Your tongue is unused to silence. And your mind, well, it's starting to slow down to the monastery's pace. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In the medieval monastery, the days weren't just repetitive. They were cyclical, tied tightly to the divine officer rotating series of prayer hours that shaped not just your schedule, but your sense of time itself. The ringing of the bell wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, pulling you out of bed, out of thought, out of whatever minor comfort you'd found, and back into rhythm with the rule. But there's more to the grind than prayers and pottage. You're starting to learn the subtleties now. The monastery is full of rules, but the people inside it, still human. You might notice that not all monks carry the same burden. There are distinctions, often unspoken. The abbot, for example, the head of the monastery, has his own chamber. He eats the same meals, yes, but he often gets them warmer. He's the one who decides punishments, assigns duties, and interprets the rule when things get a bit murky. Then there are the monks who've been here longer. They know how to walk silently without dragging their sandals. They've memorized scripture passages by heart. They make the sign of the cross with practiced ease, and they know all the loopholes. Take fasting, for example. Monks fasted often, Wednesdays, Fridays, during Lent, Advent, and other holy days. But fasting didn't always mean eating nothing. Sometimes it meant skipping the noon meal and doubling up at night, or substituting rich stews with dried peas and water. Over time, some monks got quite clever with it, thickening soups until they were basically stews again, or adding herbs to dull lentils until they tasted almost like meat. Then there's the question of obedience. You'd think monks were utterly devoted to their duties, and many were. But obedience in a monastery wasn't always passive. There were disagreements, quiet, mostly, but real. Sometimes about the interpretation of scripture. Other times about practical matters. Who was hoarding better tools in the workshop? Who left the herb garden untended? Who forgot to clean the ink pots in the scriptorium? Most monasteries had a way to deal with this. The chapter house. Every morning after prime, the community would gather there to confess faults, hear announcements, and receive assignments for the day. This wasn't a time for warm conversation. It was a mix of shame and efficiency. If you were caught breaking silence or falling asleep during compline, this was where it was mentioned. If you wanted to confess something voluntarily, now was the time. Punishments varied. For small faults, you might be ordered to eat on the floor, apart from the others. or to remain standing during the meal while others sat. For larger breaches like disobedience to the abbot or stealing food, you might be isolated from the community for days, or required to lie prostrate before the altar during service. In extreme cases, monks were even expelled. And yet, despite all this, many found deep comfort in the monotony. The repetition wasn't aimless, it was ritual. In a world where illness could take you without warning and war might arrive with a single rider's gallop, the monastery offered something the outside world couldn't: predictability. This was especially true when it came to work. As a monk, you weren't idle. In fact, laborari est arere work is to pray was a guiding principle, but the kind of labor varied. You might find yourself in the fields, hoeing rows of beets, or in the brewhouse, where monks carefully monitored the fermentation of ale not just for themselves, but sometimes to trade with nearby villagers. Beer was safer than water, after all. Clothing hygiene followed a similar logic. Most monks wore a habita, plain woolen tunic or robe, with a belt or cincture, and perhaps a scapula, a rectangular piece of cloth draped over the shoulders. Wool was durable and warm, but it wasn't breathable or easy to wash. That meant habits got dirty, and stayed dirty. Laundering these garments was usually done by designated brothers, sometimes lay brothers, or hired help who had access to water, soap usually made from animal fat and ash, and tubs, but habits weren't washed frequently. Some monks changed clothes only once a week, or even less. Underclothes, if worn at all, were also limited, perhaps a linen shirt or simple drawers, washed a bit more often due to direct contact with the body. And then there was hair. The familiar monk's tonsure, a shaved crown surrounded by a ring of hair, wasn't just symbolic. It also served a practical purpose. In a world with few hair products and limited grooming options, the tonsure was maintained regularly, usually every few weeks, with shears or blades. Beards were often shaved as well, though practices varied by region and order. Some monks kept long beards, others remained clean-shaven. There was no standard rule, just local tradition, but wasn't only about the body. In the monastery, it extended to spiritual cleanliness too. Dirt could be tolerated, but moral impurity could not. That meant monks were far more concerned with unclean thoughts than with unwashed feet. For many, keeping the mind pure was a daily struggle, fought not with soap and water, but with fasting, silence, and prayer. Interestingly, monasteries were often cleaner than the towns and villages outside. Even with all their rules about modest bathing, monks still valued order and sanitation. Monastic kitchens, for instance, were usually kept scrupulously clean, with assigned brothers overseeing food preparation, storage, and waste. Latrines, too, were carefully maintained, sometimes even flushed with running water. In more advanced monasteries, these reredatas, or monastic latrines, were long stone or wooden benches with holes cut above a channel of running water. In places like Cluny or Canterbury, monks constructed elaborate sewage systems to divert waste away from the cloister. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective and impressive feat of engineering, especially for the time. Toilet paper didn't exist, of course. Instead, monks used materials like moss, leaves, straw, or small scraps of linen, sometimes reused. And while this might sound dreadful to modern ears, it was considered normal. Comfort was not the goal, simplicity was. Even cleanliness rituals could be prayerful. Washing hands before meals, accompanied by short psalms, preparing for matins at midnight. likely involved a splash of cold water to the face and a whispered invocation. Every act, no matter how small, was part of the spiritual rhythm of the day. Clean hands, clean heart, dirt on the feet, fine dirt in the soul. Not so much. Still, you might wonder, didn't monks get sick? With so little washing and such close quarters, wasn't illness a constant threat? Yes and no. Monasteries had infirmaries, and monks were often more aware of health and herbal remedies than their neighbors. They grew medicinal plants, sage, lavender, thyme, mint, and used them in bombs, teas, and poultices. They treated wounds and fevers, but they also believed illness had spiritual causes. Sin could make the body sick. Prayer, fasting, and confession were seen as healing tools alongside salves and tinctures. So while you might be itchy, sweaty, and dressed in week-old wool, you'd also be part of a system that treated hygiene not as vanity but as discipline. The point wasn't to feel clean. The point was to feel humble. You were a servant of God, not your skin. Over time, you might even get used to it. You'd stop noticing the smell of stale fabric. You'd grow numb to the icy splash of morning. Wash water, your hands cracked and dry from soap made with lye, would still be raised in prayer 6 times a day, and that, to your brothers, was what mattered. But still, when it rained and the gutters overflowed, and warm steam rose from the earth, did any monks ever wish for a long hot soak? Just once, and if they did they confess it? By now, you've accepted that medieval monks didn't exactly sparkle with daily freshness. Their hygiene rituals weren't guided by modern standards of sanitation, but by theology, tradition, and necessity. Still, there's more to the story than just rare baths and woolen robes. Hygiene, in the monastic world, was a deeply layered ritual tangled in ideas of discipline, community, humility, and a surprising amount of paperwork. You see, monasteries weren't lawless. On the contrary, they were governed by customary's detailed documents specific to each house, often hundreds of pages long, outlining everything from when monks should speak to how often they could be shaved, and hygiene. It had its own section. One of the most influential customaries came from Cluny Abbey, a powerful Benedictine monastery in what is now France. There, the monks were expected to bathe 4 times a year on Holy Thursday, before Christmas, after Easter, and before the feast of Saint Benedict. This was generous by medieval standards, but even here, the rule was about uniformity, not comfort. All monks bathed together. No one received special treatment, lest you were ill, very old, or oddly enough, the guest of an important bishop. The bath itself wasn't as private or soothing as you might imagine. There were no candles, no scented oils. You'd undress, scrub as best you could with limited soap, rinse with buckets of water, and redress in garments that were perhaps only slightly less itchy than the ones you came in with. Some monasteries even required that baths be taken in silence, another reminder that the body's needs should never distract from the soul's purpose. In many monasteries, a monk was assigned the role of bathmaster, an unglamorous job involving water heating, towel distribution, and ensuring no one lingered too long. The goal wasn't pleasure, it was order. Still, small concessions were made. Foot washing, for instance, was more common and even encouraged, especially during Lent or before major feast days. It had spiritual meaning, too. Christ washed the feet of his disciples, so monks often washed one another's feet as a ritual of humility and brotherhood. This was less about hygiene and more about reverencer, way to remember that service. not superiority, was the ideal of the monastic life. And speaking of service, what about the monks who handled the dirtiest work? Every monastery had brothers assigned to the latrines, often located on the edge of the cloister, slightly downhill to help with drainage. These rary daughters weren't pleasant places, though many were sophisticated for their time with stone. Seats, flowing water, and even air vents, they still required cleaning. This meant shoveling out waste pits, scrubbing the stone, and occasionally redirecting foul water channels. The monks who did this work weren't seen as lesser. In fact, their willingness to handle filth without complaint was considered a virtue. They were often praised in chapter meetings for their humility and dedication. After all, caring for the bodily needs of the community, no matter how base, was a form of worship. But even outside these assigned duties, hygiene mattered in subtle, daily ways. For instance, fingernails had to be trimmed regularly. Long nails were associated with vanity or worse, laziness. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't specifically mention grooming, but later commentators did. Some even wrote entire treatises on modest appearance, instructing monks to avoid both extremes. No dirt-encrusted sloppiness, but also no unnecessary tidiness. The balance was always moderation, and yet contradictions crept in. Some monastic orders began to diverge on what counted as appropriate hygiene. The Cistercians, for example, were known for their strict asceticism. They avoided fancy foods, decorated chapels, and unnecessary bathing. Dirt, to them, was a sign of spiritual detachment. The Cluniacs, by contrast, were slightly more permissive, because their abbey was larger, richer, and better resourced. With access to aqueducts and fuel for heating water, they could afford the occasional warm bath. Then there were regional differences. In colder climates, like parts of England or Germany, washing was more difficult in winter. Water froze, fires were precious. In those places, monks often went months with minimal washing, relying instead on layered clothing and the hope that their outerwear absorbed the worst of it. But in warmer regions, like Spain or southern France, bathing was easier and, sometimes even more frequent. Some Spanish monasteries had inherited Roman bath traditions, including heating systems that warmed stone tiles. Though rare, these were seen as luxuries, and debates over whether they were appropriate for monks occasionally surfaced in monastic councils. Hygiene could also become political. During the later Middle Ages, reformers often pointed to lax hygiene as a symbol of monastic decline. If a monastery became too comfortable serving wine, bathing weekly, dressing to finely, it was accused of slipping into worldliness. Cleanliness became a moral issue, a measure of spiritual rigor. A clean monk might be holy or he might be vain. And then there were the monks in charge of hospitality. Most monasteries welcomed travelers, pilgrims, and the poor. A guest master handled these duties, often preparing a small, clean room for visitors and overseeing basic hygiene, offering water to wash their feet, perhaps even fresh linens. The monastery might have been rough by modern standards, but for a weary traveler covered in road dust, it was an oasis. Ironically, guests sometimes had access to more cleanliness than the monks themselves. Despite all these layers, perhaps the most surprising thing is how consistent monks were in following these odd, rigid, sometimes uncomfortable hygiene customs. They didn't complain, at least not publicly, because for them, every act was part of a broader spiritual system. Bathing wasn't about comfort, it was about obedience. Washing your hands wasn't about vanity, was about ritual. Yet imagine a novice monk newly arrived, his ears still ringing from the noise of the outside world. He's handed a stiff robe, told not to speak, and led to the lavatorium to rinse his hands with cold water from a stone spout. No soap, no towel, just a nod to tradition and a quiet murmur of Latin. Does he feel cleaner, holier, or just more confused? And when, weeks later, he's assigned to scrub the raridator with vinegar and straw, bent over the worn stones in silence, does he think of it as sacred work, or just filth? Or maybe both. There's something oddly comforting about how monks approached hygiene. It wasn't about sparkle or shine, it was about rhythm. Daily tasks, even the messy ones, became part of a quiet, humming cycle of prayer, labor, and sleep. And in that rhythm, the line between the sacred and the mundane began to blur. By now, you've walked the stone cloisters, heard the splash of water in the lavatorium, and imagined the cold sting of a winter foot wash. But what's most striking is that over the centuries, these rituals change surprisingly little. In fact, if you wandered into a Benedictine monastery in the 9th century, and then again in the 13th, you'd likely recognize the same routine. Wake in the dark, whisper psalms, wash with water cold enough to make you wince, dress in wool, scrub vegetables, clean the latrine, rinse your hands, sleep. Repeat. There were seasonal changes, of course. In summer, water might be more plentiful. In winter, ice sometimes had to be broken in the washing basins. Soap was a luxury often made in-house, using old recipes passed down from one herbalist monk to another. Lye from ashes, fat from slaughtered animals, boiled with fragrant herbs if they were available, though more often it simply smelled like lye and fat. Some monks preferred scraping rather than washing, rubbing the skin with rough cloth or even sand to remove grime. This practice was inherited, in part, from earlier Roman customs, where olive oil was rubbed into the skin and scraped off with a curved tool called a scrigule. Medieval monks didn't have scrigules, but the concept lingered. Remove the surface, and you cleanse the soul. Or something close to that. Still, not all hygiene involved the body. Much of it happened on parchment. Monks were not just bathers and bakers, they were record keepers. And in their detailed customals, they tracked when habits were to be laundered, which days allowed trimming of the beard, how often water was to be changed in the lavatorium, and even where soap was stored. These books were often copied, passed on, and updated, forming a kind of bureaucratic hygiene legacy. Some customaries even gave instructions for handling lice. Yes, livestock, the ever-present companions of medieval life. There were rules for inspecting, your robes for them, for quietly excusing yourself to deal with an infestation, and for not complaining. It was frowned upon to scratch, to obviously during choir. A monk with lice was not unclean in the moral sense, but he might be moved to a side bench so he wouldn't distract the brother next to him. Lice were a nuisance, not a sin, but scratching during vespers, that could be considered irreverent for monks who couldn't sleep due to lice. There were herbal remedies, lavender stuffed into pillows, vinegar rubbed behind the ears, or even prayers whispered in the dark. Deliver us from the itch, one scribe scrawled in the margins of a psalter. And yet, despite the discomfort, monks lived long lives, often longer than their secular peers. This was partly due to better diets, clean water from monastic wells, and a relatively stable routine. Even if you only bathed 3 times a year, you were less likely to catch a fever than the farmer drinking downstream from a village tannery. Infirmaries, too, were more advanced than many expect. Monastic medicine was a mix of observation, herbal knowledge, and theological theory. A monk with a skin condition might be treated with nettle salve or told to pray more. A cough might earn you a broth of leeks, or perhaps time in a warmer cell. Clean sheets were rare but not unknown, and though surgical tools existed, they were used cautiously and sparingly. Hygiene, then, was part of a broader system of care. Not indulgence, not aesthetics, just care. And for monks, caring for the self was not selfish, it was a duty. You kept yourself clean, not to impress, but to be of service, to be alert for prayer, to not fall ill and burden the community. Yet, as the centuries passed, tensions grew. Monks debated how clean was too clean. Some newer orders, like the Carthusians, doubled down on solitude and simplicity. Others, like the Augustinians, began to blend with urban life, adopting slightly more comfortable routines. In towns, friars became more visible, preaching, teaching, even bathing a bit more often. Cleanliness became not just a monastic concern, but a public one. Still, the old habits lingered in remote abbeys. A once-a-season bath remained the norm well into the late Middle Ages. The lavatorium still dripped with water from rain-fed cisterns. Feet were still washed on Maundy Thursday. Robes were still boiled, dried, and returned with the faint scent of ash and lye. And some monks, it seems, were secretly delighted by these little moments. One surviving letter from a Cistercian monk written to a brother in another abbey includes this line: "I was permitted a bath for St. Peter's feast, and I confess, I lingered. Imagine that, in a world where every moment was scheduled and every indulgence scrutinized. A few extra minutes beneath warm water could feel like a revolution, or a sin, or both. So what do we make of all this now, in our age of soaps and shampoos, hot showers, and antimicrobial everything? We could laugh, perhaps, at the monks scrubbing lice with vinegar or washing their feet by candlelight in January. We could wince at the thought of woolen habits worn week after week, or latrines cleaned with straw brooms and resolve. But beneath it all is a kind of poetry, a world where every act, even the messiest, was part of something bigger, where cleanliness was never just about the body, and where the simple act of washing your hands could feel like a prayer. So, as we drift away from the cloister and let the monastery sink into the dark again, one quiet question lingers. If your own daily routines were treated like rituals, would they change? And if you washed not just to feel clean, but to feel connected to others, to purpose, to something divine, would it feel different? Let's take a breath and step into a room that doesn't echo. The doors creak as they close behind you. The cold stone floor taps under your feet softly, always softly, and ahead, under narrow arched windows, you see them. Men hunched like question marks, their woolen habits brushing the benches, each one entirely still except for the slow movement of a quill dot. This is the scriptorium, the nerve center of a monastery, not full of sound, but of purpose. No chanting here, no communal cooking, no washing of feet or scrubbing of floors, just the scratch of metal on skin, over and over again. Welcome to the world of the medieval scribe. It's not what you'd call exciting work. In fact, some monks dreaded the scriptorium more than fasting days, not because they didn't value it, but because it required everything from the body and gave back little in return. It was labor, spiritual devotion, and prolonged suffering all at once, and yet, without these men and their tired eyes, we might know almost nothing of the world before printing. Let's start with the basics. A scribe needed a bench, a slanted writing desk, a quill, ink, and an unyielding level of patience. The bench was rarely comfortable, often a simple wooden board, no cushions, no breaks. Sometimes a second board was placed behind the back to keep the monk upright, not out of kindness, but discipline. Slouching could lead to crooked lines, and crooked lines were no laughing matter. The manuscript pages weren't paper, they were parchment, usually made from sheep or goatskin, smooth, stretched, dried, scraped, and cut. Parchment was both precious and stubborn. The scribe had to learn its mood. Some sheets absorbed ink too quickly, others repelled it. Some had roughness, others a kind of oily slickness. No two pages were identical, and every one could betray you with a single slip. The quill that came from a goose, preferably from the left wing if the scribe was right-handed, dangled just so. Quills had to be trimmed constantly. A dull tip could ruin a whole page. And trimming took practice. Too much cut and the nib split. Too little and the letters looked smudged. Monks carried penknives, not for self-defense, but for self-editing. And the ink. Ink. Medieval ink was a concoction of ground oak galls, those knobby growths on trees, mixed with iron salts and gum. The result was a deep, dark brown that aged into black. But it thickened fast, dried faster, and smelled faintly of vinegar and rot. In summer it could spoil. In winter it could freeze. Monks often warmed their inkwells under their robes, careful not to let the heat thin it too much. You might imagine that the hardest part was the physical toll, and you wouldn't be wrong. A day in the scriptorium meant hours of bending forward, squinting at lines, gripping tools in the same fingers until they trembled. Back pain, eye strain, and cramped hands were constant. There are even scribal notes left in margins, whispering complaints across the centuries. As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe. Oh, my hand, the ink is thin and I am tired. But it wasn't just the body, it was the tedium, the repetition. Imagine copying the Psalms 150 of them, over and over again, word by word, letter by letter. Imagine that every capital letter had to be gilded or colored by another monk after you'd finished. And if you made a mistake, well, if it was small, you might scrape it off with your knife. If it was large, you might be told to start over. Some scriptoria employed correctors monks, whose sole job was to check each line for errors. And they were meticulous. A missed et or a misplaced comma might warrant a correction, but a theological error confusing a saint's name or misspelling a Latin phrase, that could be disastrous. And so, even in silence, pressure filled the room, yet despite this pressure, scribes developed strange little habits to keep themselves sane. Some would whisper the words as they wrote them. Others would mark time by sunlight, vowing to finish a chapter before the patch of light reached the edge of the desk. A few grew fond of certain letters, curling them elaborately as a small rebellion against monotony. And once in a while, one would slip in a note, not to be read aloud, of course, just a quiet release. One such note reads, "Here ends the second book. Thanks be to God, it is cold." Another, "He who does not know how to write thinks it no labor. But oh, if only he knew." You can almost see him, can't you? That tired monk, shoulders aching, blinking at a flickering candle, praying not for inspiration, but for daylight. And yet these tired hands produced beauty. Illuminated manuscripts were often works of art, even in modest abbeys. though not every page was gilded. Some had delicate flourishes in red or blue. Others included marginal doodles' faces, animals, even monks falling asleep at their desks. These little touches remind us that beneath the robes, these were men. Tired, grumpy, bored men with ink-stained fingers and a sense of humor. Still, the purpose of their work wasn't personal expression. It was preservation. To copy a manuscript was to preserve, not just scripture, but knowledge, grammar, philosophy, medicine, history. Even the texts of ancient Rome and Greece, Cicero, Virgil, Aristotle survived because monks painstakingly reproduced them. Without this invisible labor force, the intellectual world of Europe might have been swept away entirely. It's strange to think that boredom helped save civilization, but it did. And while most scribes remained anonymous, a few signed their names quietly, not with pride, but perhaps with quiet relief. A small reminder that they were here, that they gave their lives, or at least their eyesight, so others could read. So now, as the candle burns lower in the scriptorium, and the cold settles in around those bent figures, we're left with a quiet question. If you had to copy the same book every day for the rest of your life, what would you choose? The candle has burned an inch shorter, and the scriptorium is quieter than before, if such a thing is possible. There's a particular kind of silence here. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. Time itself seems slower, stretching thin between the turning of one parchment page and the next. And the scribes, well, they are still writing. As dawn slips into the cold grey of a monastic morning, the scribe tightens the cord of his robe and dips his quill into the thickened ink. Today he continues copying the book of Job. Fitting, really, Job knew something about suffering. We're deep into the daily rhythm of a scribe's life now, and it is rhythm more than ritual. Each hour divided, each task assigned. A life dictated not by creativity, but by the bell. You see, the monastery ran on ora et labora, pray and work. For most monks, this meant a balance of physical chores and spiritual practice. But for the scribes, both were rolled into one. Copying texts wasn't just labor, it was a form of worship. But it was also, frankly, exhausting. Scribes weren't always young. Some were middle-aged by the time they earned the skill or patience to be trusted in the scriptorium. Others had been selected in youth for their neat handwriting, trained, not just in letters, but in the art of calligraphy, punctuation, and Latin syntax. And while we might think of monks as celibate scholars, many were once farmers, soldiers, or sons of merchants. Literacy wasn't guaranteed. It was earned. Painfully, imagine learning to draw every letter perfectly, not just legibly, artistically and consistently. Medieval script was not casual handwriting. It was a carefully curated style, specific to each region and even each abbey. Irish monasteries favored the looping curves of insular script. Carolingian scribes developed a rounded hand clearer, more readable, and eventually adopted by court. In fact, Charlemagne's reforms around 800 AD did much to standardize scribing. He wanted a uniform script across his empire, something clean, something official. This effort led to the spread of Carolingian minuscule, which later influenced the very fonts we use today. But writing in this style was grueling. Each letter required balance, proportion, and spacing. No lines were printed on the parchment. Those had to be ruled manually, often with a lead stylus or a thin, scored blade. If the lines were crooked, the entire page could look warped, and This mattered a lot. Monastic books weren't private reading material. Most were liturgical texts meant for chanting, study, or teaching. Errors weren't just embarrassing, they could be heretical. A missing knot in a commandment could turn theology on its head. So scribes developed mnemonic tricks, visual cues, and sometimes even musical rhythms to help them stay focused. Because no one, no matter how devout, could stay sharp after 6 hours of straight Latin. Now, let's talk about illumination. Not all scribes were illuminators, but every manuscript hoped to be beautiful. In wealthier monasteries, a second class of monk or lay artisan would add colored flourishes, gold leaf, or tiny illustrations. They worked in nearby rooms called illuminators' chambers, often using brushes made from squirrel hair and pigments ground from minerals like lapis lazuli and cinnabar. But sometimes, especially in smaller monasteries, a scribe had to do both: write the text, then go back and decorate it. Imagine spending 3 days writing a single chapter, then carefully painting a red and blue capital letter without spilling ink or misaligning the margins. And all this with flickering light and stiff fingers. Mistakes did happen, of course, and the ways scribes corrected them tell us a lot. A minor slip, say, an extra stroke or misplaced vowel could be scraped off gently with a pen. The area would be smoothed with pumice and, if needed, re-inked. But sometimes, corrections were more creative. One manuscript contains a little sketch of a man pointing at the word with a note. Read this instead. Others simply crossed out the error and wrote the right word above. Then there were the marginalia, tiny notes in the margins. Some were functional, page references, commentary, alternative readings, but others were personal. One monk doodled a cat chasing a mouse. Another wrote, "I am very cold," beside a particularly long psalm. These human touches, incidental, bored, or quietly humorous, are the closest thing we have to hearing the scribes' real voices. Now let's turn briefly to something often overlooked: the mental toll of copying sacred texts. You might imagine that spending your days transcribing the Gospels would strengthen your faith. And maybe it did for some. But for others, the pressure to avoid mistakes, to preserve truth perfectly, could become overwhelming. Some scribes began to fear their work. To write God's word was to shoulder a heavy responsibility. One slip of ink, one letter forgotten, and centuries of doctrine could be misrepresented. This fear is evident in the way many monks ended their texts with apologies. If this book has any fault, let it be blamed not on the author, but on my weakness. Or pray for the soul of the scribe, that he may be forgiven the faults of his hand. Their humility wasn't always literary flourish. It was material, spiritual anxiety about being the human vessel through which divine words passed. And there's another layer of burden here. You see, monks often copied texts they did not understand. Latin was the sacred language of the Church, but not every monk mastered it fully. Many copied phonetically, letter by letter, without grasping meaning. For them, scribing was not intellectual, it was physical devotion. And what a paradox that is. Copying wisdom without absorbing it, yet preserving it for others who might. The scribe, in that sense, was a silent bridge between the past and the future. They didn't get to cross the bridge, they just built it. So, let's pause again. Think of the cold fingers, the cracked skin, the ink stains on the hem of a wool robe. Think of the candle smoke curling into stone arches, of the eyes red-rimmed and tired, scanning the same line for the 4th time, just to be sure. And imagine this: the book is almost done. The final chapter sits before him. One more page. But he knows when this is done, another will follow. A new commission, a new scroll, more ink, more parchment. No glory, no break, no real end, just more words. So, what kept him going? The quiet shuffle of robes on stone, the dry scratch of quill against skin, the faint smell of iron ink and lamp. Oil. It's afternoon now in the scriptorium, and the sunlight has narrowed to slanted golden lines across the desks. Still, the scribes work. Still, they write. It is easy to forget how invisible their world was. They copied the names of kings, the wisdom of saints, the laws of God, and the legends of old, but their own names were barely written at all. Most scribes remained anonymous. No biography, number, credit, no record beyond the margins. In this way, the life of a scribe was both deeply humble and, paradoxically, profoundly influential. These monks were not inventors, not artists in the way we think of artists today. Their skill lay in replication, not originality. Yet they preserved entire civilizations, letter by painstaking letter. So what happened to these manuscripts once completed? In most monasteries, the scriptorium fed into a library, though not quite the kind we picture now. These were small rooms, often windowless, with wooden shelves or chained lecterns. Books were rare and valuable. Many were chained too. Desks to prevent theft, not out of paranoia, but necessity. A single book could take months or years to produce, requiring the skins of dozens of animals and countless hours of labor. Only a few monks had permission to borrow books, and even then they often read them aloud, slowly as reading silently. Was a skill still developing? Books weren't just for consumption, they were part of a sacred performance of memory, voice, and silence. Some monasteries also became hubs of intellectual exchange. Irish and Anglo-Saxon monasteries, in particular, were known for sending books and scribes across Europe, helping to reintroduce classical knowledge to the continent. Charlemagne's Renaissance, for example, was built in part on the efforts of these humble scribes. But even so, the scribes' work remained largely hidden. In the eyes of the Church, they were servants of God's word, not creators of it, and, in many cases, their lives blurred into the background, quiet, repetitive. Thankless this brings us to a strange truth. Many scribes died young, not in dramatic ways, usually, but the toll of sedentary work, cold stone rooms, and eye-straining candlelight added up. Inflammation, arthritis, lung issues from lamp smoke, and failing vision were common. There are records of monks going blind from years in the scriptorium. Some were reassigned to lighter duties. Others simply kept writing, even as the lines blurred. Yet despite all this, scribes often left behind traces of joy. In the margins of serious texts, we find small drawings, sometimes playful, sometimes nonsensical. A knight fighting a snail, a monk playing bagpipes, a cat licking itself next to a verse from Isaiah. What do we make of these? Some scholars suggest they were acts of rebellion, a secret wink from monk to future reader. Others think they were simply ... human. A tired scribe letting his mind wander, a bit of personality breaking through the rules. In some books, scribes even debated each other. One might copy a text and leave a note in the margin. This was poorly written. A later scribe might respond, "Do better yourself, fool." 1,000 years later, we're still laughing at their side arguments. And maybe that's what makes these tired, ink-stained men so compelling. They were not machines. They were not saints. They were flawed, bored, clever, disciplined, and quietly funny. They were people who gave everything to a task no one would remember them for. Their world was slow, repetitive, often achingly dull. But that's also why it worked. The scriptorium wasn't a place of creativity in the modern sense. It was a place of preservation through tedium. One monk would spend years copying a book he would never read for pleasure, so that someone else, somewhere, someday, might. That's the strange poetry of it. The scribe didn't write for an audience. He didn't expect applause. He wrote because the work had to be done, because silence could be beautiful, because copying the past, slowly and painfully, was the only way to carry it forward. And while the world eventually moved on, first with faster pens, then printing presses, and finally keyboards, the echoes of the scriptorium still linger. Even today, our fonts trace their origins to Carolingian script. Our paragraphs, our punctuation, our spacing conventions, many of them were shaped by medieval scribes trying to bring order to chaos. Their influence is baked into the very letters you're reading now. So, if you've ever typed a sentence, or annotated a book, or marveled at the clean flow of a well-laid-out page, you owe something, in a strange and invisible way, to the quiet monks who sat under cold windows, breathing in ink and wax, turning goatskin into gospel. Let's end with one more scribal note, written by a monk who'd just completed a massive psalter he penned. Here ends the work, by the grace of God. Let the writer now rest his hand. You can almost hear the sigh. Not grand, not wholly just tired. Grateful, perhaps, that he got to the end without spilling ink or smudging a page, ready to be told what to copy next. And so we close this chapter, not with a grand revelation, but with the flicker of a candle and a stretch of aching fingers, still ... The question remains, drifting like dust in the sunlight of that stone room. If no one remembers your name, but your work endures, was that enough? By now, you've become familiar with the monastery's stone walls, its rhythm of bells, its quiet candlelit corners. But tonight, we take a different path, one that doesn't lead through the library or the chapel, but around the back, past the herb gardens, and out into the fields. There, with dirt under their nails and silence on their tongues, you'll find the lay brothers, also called conversi. These were men who lived inside monasteries, but did not chant in choir or copy scripture. They took vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, but their lives were not spent in Latin prayer. Instead, they ploughed the land, tended the sheep, brewed the beer, and milked the goats. They were monks of the hoe and the hammer, not the scroll. For every Benedictine or Cistercian monk you picture praying in a long cloak, there might have been 2 or 3 lay brothers nearby beheaded, sleeves rolled, hauling water or gathering turnips. It was a life of service, not scholarship. And, perhaps even more interestingly, a life wrapped in silence. Lay brothers followed a similar rule of silence as choir monks. Speaking was limited, especially during work hours. If you needed to communicate, you used gestures, a kind of sign language. There were signs for bread, signs for sick, signs for tools, signs to ask permission. A raised hand might mean I need help. A flicked wrist might say, pass the salt. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't originally account for this division, but by the 12th century it became standard in many monastic orders, especially among the Cistercians, who valued manual labor as deeply spiritual. Work wasn't just necessary, it was sacred, a form of penance, a path to God through sweat. So what kind of work did they do? Start with the fields. Many monasteries were essentially self-contained villages, and they needed grain, vegetables, and fodder. Lay brothers rose before dawn to harness oxen, till the soil, or wade into wet, stony plots to harvest leeks and onions. The rhythm was seasonal, sowing in spring, haying in summer, threshing in autumn, repairs in winter. They also tended kitchen gardens, with rows of cabbage, parsley, fennel, and beans. Monasteries weren't wealthy in spices, but they were skilled in herbs both for flavor and for healing. It was often a lay brother who dried mint or ground mustard, crushed poppy for sleep, or pulled burdock for salves. Down in the cellars. Other lay brothers managed stores of food, turning milk into cheese, fruit into preserves, grain into ale. Medieval food didn't last long, so proper preservation was key. Salted fish, smoked meats, dried apples, all packed away in barrels or clay jars. Some were cooks, responsible for feeding both the monks and the poor at the gate. Others were brewers, because monastery beer wasn't just tradition, it was hydration. Water was often unsafe, and beer was mild enough to drink with breakfast. Still others worked as builders and smiths, cutting stone, shoeing horses, repairing carts, making hinges or tools. If a monastery needed a wheelbarrow, a candle mold, or a pulley, it was probably a lay brother who fashioned it. But despite this labor, the lay brothers weren't just servants. They were members of the religious community, with their own places in the dormitory, their own rules, their own set of spiritual responsibilities. They prayed daily, though not as often or as long as the choir monks. They attended Mass, even if they stood at the back, and they were buried in monastic grounds, often near the orchard or in a quieter corner of the graveyard. Still, the divide was clear. Lay brothers couldn't become abbots. They didn't read Latin, and many were illiterate. Altogether, they entered religious life not from wealth or education, but from poverty. Some were former soldiers or farmers. Others were peasants seeking spiritual security, a warm bed, and a meaningful life in return. They gave their backs and their hands. But this division wasn't always harmonious. As monastic wealth grew, especially in the later Middle Ages, some choir monks began to see lay brothers more as workers than brothers. Tasks grew heavier. Respect sometimes thinned. In some abbeys, lay brothers pushed back or left entirely. Others endured, believing that manual labor was their offering. Not all prayers are sung. Some are whispered in the effort to lift a heavy cart, or carried in the hush of planting a seed by moonlight. Their lives were often hidden from history. There are fewer records of lay brothers than of monks, fewer names, fewer stories. But we glimpse them sometimes in building accounts, harvest records, and letters complaining about broken tools or empty cellars. We even catch glimpses in the surviving architecture. Monasteries often had separate dormitories or refectories for lay brothers, reflecting a parallel world within the same stone walls. They walked the same cloisters, but sat at different tables, heard the same bells, but answered in different ways. And perhaps the most telling detail, in some monasteries, lay brothers entered through a different door, not out of shame, not because they were less, but because their path, though parallel, was distinct. They followed God by another road, not through books, but through toil, not with ink, but with calloused palms and worn shoes. Imagine, if you will, one of them now. He wakes before light, pulls on a wool tunic, washes with cold water from a basin. He does not speak. Instead, He nods to the brother next to him. They shoulder baskets. One heads to the vineyard, one to the orchard, another to the chicken coop. By the time the choir, monks gather for matins, the lay brothers are already in the barn, mucking stalls. By prime, they're sorting apples. By sext, they might break for a silent meal bread, a little cheese, an ale, then return to the grain shed. It's hard, repetitive, quiet, but there's something almost meditative about it, something enduring, a rhythm that does not crave applause. And so the question rises, as we rest beneath this soft veil of medieval routine. If a life is lived in silence, in service, and mostly unseen, does that make it any less meaningful? The monastery, like a body, moved according to its own quiet rhythms. The choir monks were its voice, raised in Latin chants at 7 sacred hours. The abbot was the head, deciding, guiding, disciplining, and the lay brothers, they were the hands and feet, always in motion, always working. Their days were divided not by leisure or conversation, but by the practical demands of a medieval monastery. The goats had to be milked, the bread kneaded, the garden hoed, the cloister swept, and all of it, every swing of the axe, every turn of the soil was done without idle chatter. Silence wasn't just a preference, it was a practice, grounded in humility. The lay brothers, or conversi, were expected to obey without grumbling, to labor without boasting, to serve without seeking notice. In this sense, their world was built on a foundation of invisible virtues, the kind that doesn't shine in stained glass, but glows faintly in memory, like a candle left burning for no one in particular. They weren't hermits or loners. They lived in community. But theirs was a quieter current beneath the surface of monastic life. One fascinating element of that life was the monastic economy they supported. You see, monasteries didn't just pray, they produced, and it was the lay brothers who made. These possible monasteries often functioned like rural corporations, with holdings that included farms, fisheries, vineyards, breweries, and workshops. If you visited a well-established abbey in the 11th or 12th century, you might find everything from a sheepfold to a cider press to a small forge. This economy wasn't about profit in the modern sense. It was about self-sufficiency and hospitality. Benedictine rule required monasteries to care for travelers, the poor, and the sick. That meant storing grain, baking extra loaves, brewing more ale than the monks could drink, and keeping a few beds warm. The lay brothers managed all of it. Take the brewery, for instance. Monasteries became renowned for their ale not just because it was safer than water, but because beer was considered a liquid food, light, nourishing, and with just enough alcohol to preserve it. Brewing was a precise craft. You had to measure barley, soak and germinate it, dry it in kilns, mash it, boil it with herbs before hops became standard, ferment it, and store it in casks. Each step had to be timed, cleaned, watched, and all of it happened under the care of lay brothers, who might never taste more than a sip from each batch, or consider cheese-making. Monasteries often kept cows or goats, and milk had to be used quickly. It might be churned into butter, but more often it was curdled, pressed, salted, and aged into cheese. This was a skill passed down through practice, not through books, through hands, not ink. And that leads to a curious truth. Many lay brothers were illiterate, while choir monks studied scripture, philosophy, and Latin grammar. Most conversi could not read or write. Their spiritual life was therefore more physical, more tactile. They expressed devotion by crafting, digging, hauling, and baking. Their prayers were often internal, silent, or memorized by heart. This created a sort of dual spirituality within. The monastery choir monks lived by the liturgical calendar. Lay brothers lived by the agricultural one, while the monks marked feast days and recited hours. The lay brothers watched the sky for frost, counted eggs, and checked the dryness of hay. They were men of dirt and seasons, calluses and cartsless. Theological, perhaps, but no less faithful. Still, tensions existed. By the 13th century, some lay brothers began to feel the strain of inequality. As monasteries grew richer, choir monks often spent less time in physical labor, while lay brothers bore the full weight of daily toil. Their diet was sometimes coarser, their dormitories simpler, their role more taken for granted. In some cases, lay brothers left especially during times of famine or social unrest. In other cases, monasteries began to hire paid servants instead, reducing the number of conversi altogether. But for centuries, the lay brotherhood endured, and not without joy, despite the work. Many found moments of quiet satisfaction, like harvesting apples just before the first frost, or watching baby chicks peck their way free. Even silence itself could be comforting once it became familiar. It was a world without argument, without gossip, without distraction. There were small rituals that marked time, the warming of hands by the oven in winter, the ringing of the bell for midday rest, the comforting weight of bread dough folding under the heel of the palm. They also participated in feasts and fasts, though in slightly different ways. On feast days, they might receive a better cut of meat or a second portion of ale. During Lent, they would fast like the choir monks, though they often had a heavier physical burden to carry, and when death came, it came softly. Lay brothers were buried in the monastic grounds, sometimes in a separate plot, often without elaborate markers. Their graves were simple: a stone, a cross, a record in the abbey's necrologif, but occasionally a few words were carved. Not their deeds, not their names, but something like, "He served well," or "faithful in work." Simple, final, and maybe enough, because for a lay brother, success was measured in service, not legacy. To be unknown in life, but essential. To be uncelebrated, yet central to survival. To pray without words, and give without expecting to be remembered. So tonight, we pause for them, the monks of the barn, the workshop, the kitchen, the ones who didn't preach or sing, but carried the monastery on their backs. And as we linger in this quiet world of vegetable plots and flickering lanterns, we might wonder, can a life built entirely from small, invisible acts be the holiest life of all? By the time twilight settled over the monastery, the work of the lay brothers was done or nearly. The cows were milked, the grain sacks had been hauled into storage, the floors swept clean of husks and dirt. Silence had returned, and with it, the slow procession toward vespers and rest, though lay brothers were not usually present in the choir stalls. Their day ended on a similar note: quiet reflection, a small shared meal, and perhaps a whispered prayer. Life in the monastery moved according to centuries-old rhythms. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, cracks began to form in that stability. The world beyond the cloister walls was changing, and slowly, quietly, the role of the lay brother began to fade. At the heart of this shift was the monastic economy itself. You see, monasteries had long been reliant on the labor of lay brothers to maintain their self-sufficient lifestyles. But as land holdings expanded and donations from nobles increased, many abbeys grew wealthy. That wealth paradoxically, made manual labor less appealing to the choir monks, and more outsourced, paid laborers than farmers, millers, even craftsmen began replacing the lay brothers in certain roles. These workers weren't bound by vows. They came and went with wages, and while they lacked the spiritual connection to the monastery, they were often more efficient or skilled in specialized trades. The lay brother, once the backbone of the monastery's working life, found his role gradually reduced. Compounding this shift was a decline in vocations. Fewer young men were choosing the life of a converse. The path was demanding, the rewards intangible, and the disciplines strict. For peasants seeking to rise in the world or simply survive, monastery might have once offered safety, shelter, and a regular routine. But by the late Middle Ages, that appeal had dimmed. And then came the Black Death, when plague swept across Europe in the 14th century. Monastic communities were not spared. Entire houses were decimated. Records from the times speak of monks dying faster than they could be buried. And while choir monks are more often remembered in surviving chronicles, many lay brothers, too, were lost anonymously, without epitaphs. This mortality created a new problem: labor shortages. With so many gone, monasteries turned increasingly to outside help. And with that shift came a gradual decline in the conversi tradition. By the 15th century, in many places, the lay brother as a formal role had diminished, and in some cases disappeared entirely. But for the centuries in which they thrived, lay brothers left behind a quiet legacy. Their contributions weren't preserved in illuminated manuscripts. You won't find them painted in altarpieces or praised in Latin verse, but they are there in the mortar of abbey walls, in the grooves of worn garden paths, in the iron tools left behind in monastic barns and forges. They were the embodiment of stability, what the Benedictine rule called stabilitas loci, the virtue of staying rooted in one place, one routine, one life of labor and prayer. In an age of wars, famines, and roving lords, the monastery was an island of order, and the lay brothers were its stewards. They held an odd position in medieval society, somewhere between the sacred and the secular. Not quite monks, not quite servants, bound by vows, but often left out of religious discussions. Essential, but rarely acknowledged, and yet there is a deep dignity in their story. Imagine waking each day before the sun, not to achieve fame or wealth, but to repair a fence, to shovel manure, to feed chickens, to make cheese, to ring a bell, to kneel, to sweep, to carry water, to kneel again, to live your whole life that way with no expectation that your name would be remembered. Their world was full of boring tasks. Yes, but those tasks were the foundation of monastic life. Without them, no hymn could be sung with a full belly, no page copied in a warm room, no charity extended to pilgrims or the poor. Even their silence spoke volumes. Many monasteries had signs or hand gestures for common objects and tasks, allowing the lay brothers to communicate without speaking. Over time, entire vocabularies developed. One sign for bread, another for hoe, still another for tired. They created a language without sound, a kind of monastic semaphore passed between bowed heads and calloused hands. And that's part of what makes their world so hauntingly beautiful. It was a world of gestures, not proclamations, of service, not ceremony, of effort without reward. Tonight, as we rest and let our minds drift through the darkened cloisters, it's worth pausing for a moment on this final thought. In a time when everything was fragile, when kings could fall, crops could fail, and empires could crumble. What endured? Not the banners or the battles, not the names carved in stone, but perhaps the quiet persistence of people like the lay brothers, people who rose every morning with aching joints and sore backs, who kept to their tasks with humility, and who found peace not in recognition but in routine. There's a kind of holiness in that, a kind of heroism, even if no one thought to call it that at the time. And maybe those silent hands, washing vegetables by moonlight or folding laundry in a stone alcove, helped hold up the medieval world more than we'll ever know.